Good afternoon. Happy Friday, everybody. We made it. We are finally here. It's Friday. It's already been a crazy day for me. I hope you guys are having a good day. Crazy, but I feel good because I've gotten a lot done. And we've gotten a lot done in War and Peace. So thank you for joining me for Quarantine Story Time with War and Peace. We are well into the end of the book. Today we are starting part 2 of volume 4, and we'll actually probably read about half of part 2. So we're going to read sections 1 through 10 today. And just a quick reminder, you can always check out the playlist on my channel with all the War and Peace readings if you missed one or are late and need to catch the beginning of one. We did a couple of really long readings the last couple of days, so thank you guys for bearing with me on that. And I lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry. Yeah, so there's the playlist there. And I guess we can just quick recap, though. It's 1812, Napoleon's invaded Russia, Moscow's on fire, and one of our main characters, Prince Andrei, just died. His sister, Princess Maria, got to be with him, and in doing so, she formed like sort of a bond, it seemed, with Natasha Rostov, who was with him at the same time. Also, Princess Maria and the young Count Nikolai Rostov seem to have affection for each other, so we're wondering if that'll go anywhere. And Sonia, because she thought that Prince Andrei might recover and him and Natasha might renew their relationship, has released Nikolai Rostov from their promise to be engaged and be married. So there could be the possibility that he might propose to Princess Maria, but we will just see because he is still away in the army. And Pierre, the Count Pierre Bezukhov, has been captured by the French and not executed, but is in French care. And I think that's a little recap for most all of our characters. So let's go ahead and jump in. Also, let me know, guys, I have the live chat up, and there we go. I have the live chat up, so of course feel free to say hi. But also I'm testing a new microphone today, so if you're not getting sound or if the sound sounds faint or not very clear, just let me know. But I'm going to be testing a couple microphones over the next week just to see what kind of sound quality, what seems to work best for us here. And literally, of course, we're getting a good microphone right at the end of the book. But that's all right. Maybe we will continue quarantine reading with some other piece of classic literature. So also feel free to start thinking about what book you'd like to hear next. And if I have it available, we will get reading it. Though, fair warning, I've read almost all, I think I've read all the completed works of Jane Austen. So no Jane Austen. Maybe some Dickens. I haven't read a ton. I could stand to read some more, or maybe some more Russian literature. Who knows? Or take a break and read something completely different. But yeah, if anyone has any thoughts on that, also feel free to leave a comment. All right, let's get going then. Volume 4, Part 2, Section 1. The totality of the causes of phenomena is inaccessible to the human mind, but the need to seek out causes has been put into the soul of man, and the human mind, without grasping in their countlessness and complexity the conditions of phenomena, of which each separately may appear as a cause, takes hold of the first, most comprehensible approximation and says, "Here is the cause." In historical events, where the subject of observation is the actions of people, the most primordial approximation appears as the will of gods, then as the will of those people who stand in the most conspicuous historical place, the historical heroes. But we need only inquire into the essence of any historical event, that is, into the activity of the entire mass of people who took part in the event, to become convinced that the will of the historical hero not only does not guide the action of the masses, but is itself constantly guided. It would seem to make no difference whether we understand the meaning of historical events this way or that. But between a man who says that the people of the West went to the East because Napoleon wanted it, and the man who says that it happened because it had to happen, There is the same difference as between the people who maintained that the earth stood still and the planets moved around it, and those who said that they did not know what upheld the earth, but knew that there were laws governing its movement and that of other planets. There are not and cannot be any causes of a historical event except for the one cause of all causes, but there are laws that govern events which are partly unknown, partly groped for by us. The discovery of these laws is possible only when we wholly give up looking for the causes in the will of one man, just as discovering the laws of planetary movement become possible only when people give up the notion that the earth stands still. After the Battle of Borodino, the occupation of Moscow by the enemy, and its burning, historians recognize as the most important episode of the War of 1812 the movement of the Russian army from the Ryazan to the Kaluga Road and towards the Tarutino camp, the so-called flanking march beyond Krasnaya Pakra. Historians ascribe the glory of this feat of genius to various persons and argue over whom is essentially it belongs to. Even French historians acknowledge the genius of the Russian generals when they speak of this flanking march. But why military writers and everyone else after them suppose this flanking march, which saved Russia and destroyed Napoleon, to be the most profound invention of some one person, it is very hard to understand. First of all, it is hard to understand what the profundity and genius of this movement consisted in, for it takes no great mental effort to figure out that the best position for an army, when it is not under attack, is where there are most provisions, and anyone, even a stupid 13-year-old boy, would have no difficulty figuring out that the most advantageous position for the army in 1812, after the retreat from Moscow, was on the Kaluga Road. And so it is impossible to understand, first, by what reasonings historians came to see anything profound in this maneuver. Second, it is still harder to understand precisely why historians see this maneuver as salutary for the Russians and destructive for the French. For this flanking march, under other preceding, accompanying, or following circumstances, could have been destructive for the Russian troops and salutary for the French. If, from the time this movement was accomplished, the position of the Russian army began to improve, it by no means follows that this movement was the cause of it. This flanking march might not only have failed to produce any advantages, but might have destroyed the Russian army, had it not been accompanied by coincidence of other conditions. What would have happened if Moscow had not burned down, if Murat had not lost sight of the Russians, if Napoleon had not remained inactive? If at Krasnaya Pakra the Russian army, on the advice of Bennigsen and Barclay, had offered battle? What would have happened if the French had attacked the Russians as they moved beyond the Pakra? What would have happened if Napoleon, later coming to Tarutino, had attacked the Russians with at least 1/10 of the energy with which he had attacked at Smolensk? What would have happened if the French had marched on Petersburg? With all these suppositions, the salutariness of the flanking march might have turned to destruction. The third and most incomprehensible thing consisted in the fact that the people who study history deliberately refuse to see that the flanking march cannot possibly be ascribed to any one man, that no one ever foresaw it, that at the time this maneuver, just like the retreat from Filí, was never pictured by anyone in its entirety, but proceeded step by step, event by event, moment by moment, from a countless number of the most diverse conditions, and only presented itself in its entirety when it had been accomplished and become past. At the council in Filí, the predominant thought of the Russian command was that a retreat straight back, that is, down the Nizhny Novgorod road, went without saying. The proof of it was the fact that the majority of voices at the council voted in that sense, and above all, the well-known conversation after the council between the commander-in-chief and Lanskoy, who was in charge of provisions. Lanskoy reported to the commander-in-chief that provender for the army was collected mainly along the Oka, in Tula and Kaluga provinces, and that in case of a retreat towards Nizhny, the supply of provisions would be separated from the army by the large river Oka, transport across which was usually impossible at the beginning of winter. This was the first sign of the need to deviate from heading straight for Nizhny, the direction of which had previously seemed most natural. The army kept more to the south, down to the Ryazan road and closer to the supplies. Later on, the inactivity of the French, who had even lost sight of the Russian army, the concern with defending the Tula factory, and above all the advantages of being closer to the supplies, made the armies deviate still further to the south, to the Tula road. And moving to the Tula road in a desperate push, beyond the Pakra, the commanders of the Russian army had in mind staying near Podolsk, and there were no thought of the Tarutino position. But a countless number of circumstances and the reappearance of the French troops who had previously lost sight of the Russians, and the plans for battle, and above all the abundance of provisions in Kaluga, made our army deviate still more to the south and more to the middle of its supply lines from the Tula to the Kaluga road, to Tarantino. Just as it is impossible to answer the question of when Moscow was abandoned, so it is impossible to answer precisely when and by whom it was decided to move to Tarantino. Only when the troops had already reached Tarantino, owing to countless differential forces, only then did people begin to assure themselves that they had wanted it and had long foreseen it. Section 2. The famous flanking march consisted only in that the Russian army, retreating straight back in the opposite direction of its advance, once the advance of the French stopped, deviated from the straight direction it had first followed, and not seeing anyone pursuing it, naturally tended towards the side it was drawn to by the abundance of provisions. If we picture to ourselves, not commanders of genius at the head of the Russian army, but simply the army alone without any leaders, that army could not have done anything other than make a reverse movement towards Moscow, ascribing an arc on one side where there were more provisions and the land was more abundant. This movement from the Nizhny Novgorod to the Ryazan, Tula, and Kaluga roads was so natural that the looters of the Russian army ran back in the same direction, and it was in the same direction that demands came from Petersburg for Kutuzov to move his army. In Tarutino, Kutuzov was almost reprimanded by the sovereign for leading the army to the Ryazan road, and that very position opposite Kaluga was pointed out to him, which he was already in when he received the letter from the sovereign. Rolling back in the direction of the push, given it during the whole campaign and at the Battle of Borodino, the ball of the Russian army, with the exhaustion of the forces of the push and not receiving any new pushes, assumed the position that was natural for it. Kutuzov's merit consisted not in some strategic maneuver of genius, as they call it, but in that he alone understood the significance of what was happening. He alone already understood then the significance of the French army's inactivity. He alone went on insisting that the Battle of Borodino had been a victory. He alone, who it would seem, in his position as commander-in-chief, should have been disposed to attack, he alone used all his powers to keep the Russian army from useless battles. The beast wounded at Borodino lay there where the fleeing hunter had left it, but whether it was alive and whether it was strong or only lying low, the hunter did not know. Suddenly the groaning of the beast was heard. The groaning of that wounded beast, the French army, which betrayed its destruction, was the sending of Loriston to Kutuzov's camp with a request for peace. Napoleon, with his assurance that the good was not what was good, but whatever came into his head, wrote to Kutuzov the first words that came into his head, which had no meaning at all. He wrote, Monsieur le Prince Kutuzov, I am sending you one of my adjutant generals to discuss several interesting subjects with you. I wish your highness to lend credence to what he will tell him, above all when he expresses the feelings of esteem and of special consideration which I have long held for his person. This letter, having no other aim, I pray God, Monsieur le Prince Kutuzov, that he will keep you in his holy and worthy protection. Moscow, 3rd of October, 1812, signed Napoleon. I would be cursed by posterity if I were looked upon as the prime mover of any accommodation whatsoever. Such is the present spirit of my nation. So Kutuzov replied. I would be cursed by posterity if I were looked upon as the prime mover of any accommodation whatsoever. Such is the spirit of my nation, so Kutuzov replied, and he went on using all his powers to keep the troops from attacking. During the month that the French troops were looting Moscow and the Russian troops were quietly stationed at Tarutino, a change took place in the relative strength of the two armies, in spirit and in numbers, as a result of which the advantage of strength turned out to be on the Russian side. Though the position of the French troops and their number were unknown to the Russians, as soon as the relations changed, the necessity of attacking expressed itself at once in a countless number of signs. These signs were the sending of Loristan, the abundance of provisions in Torretino, the information coming from all sides about the inactivity and disorder of the French, the replenishing of our regiments with recruits, the good weather, the prolonged rest of the Russian soldiers, the impatience usually resulting from rest among troops to do what they have all been brought together for, curiosity about what was happening in the French army they had so long lost sight of, the boldness with which Russian outposts now poked around the French stationed at Torretino, the news of easy victories of the peasants and partisans over the French, the envy it gave rise to, the desire for revenge that lay in each man's soul as long as the French were in Moscow, and, above all, the vague awareness which emerged in the soul of every soldier that the relations of strength had now changed and the advantage was now on our side. The essential relations of strength had changed, and it became necessary to attack. And, at once, as surely as a clock begins to strike and chime as soon as the hands make a full circle, so this essential change of strength was correspondingly reflected in higher spheres by an increased movement, hissing, and chiming. Section 3. The Russian army was governed by Kutuzov and his staff and by the sovereign from Petersburg. In Petersburg, before the news of the abandoning of Moscow had been received, a detailed plan for the whole war was drawn up and sent to Kutuzov for his guidance. Despite the fact that this plan was drawn up on the assumption that Moscow was still in our hands, it was approved by the staff and accepted for carrying out. Kutuzov wrote only that it is always difficult to carry out diversions from a distance. And in order to resolve the emerging difficulties, new directives and persons were sent whose responsibility it was to follow his actions and report on them. Besides that, the whole staff of the Russian army was now transformed. Bagration, who had been killed, and the offended Barclay, who had withdrawn, were replaced. Quite serious reflection was given to which would be better, to put A in B's place and B in D's place, or, on the contrary, D in A's place, and so on, if anything apart from the good pleasure of A and B could depend on it. In the army staff, because of the enmity between Kutuzov and his chief of staff, Benigsin, and the presence of the sovereign's confidential persons and these replacements, a more than usually complex play of parties went on. A undermined B, B undermines D undermines C, and so on, in all possible transpositions and combinations. In all of these underminings, the subject of the intrigues was for the most part in the business of war, which these persons wanted to conduct, but this business of war went on independently of them, precisely as it had to go on. That is, never coinciding with what people devised, but proceeding from the essential correlation of the masses. Only in higher spheres were all these devising, crisscrossing, and entangling taken as a faithful reflection of what ought to happen. The sovereign wrote on the 2nd of October in a letter received only after the Battle of Torretino, Prince Mikhail Ilarinovich, since September 2nd, Moscow has been in the hands of the enemy. Your last reports were from the 20th, and in the course of all this time, not only has nothing been undertaken for action against the enemy and the deliverance of the first throned capital, but, according to your latest reports, you have retreated even further back. Serpukhov is now occupied by an enemy detachment, and Tula, with its famous factory, so necessary for the army, is in danger. By the reports of General Winsergerode, I see that an enemy corps of 10,000 men is moving down the Petersburg road. Another of several thousand men is also heading towards Dmitrov. A third has moved forward on the Vladimir road. A fourth, a rather considerable one, is stationed between Ruza and Mozhaisk. Napoleon himself was still in Moscow on the 25th. In the light of all these reports, when the enemy has broken up his forces into strong detachments, when Napoleon himself is still in Moscow with his guards, is it possible that the enemy forces you have before you are considerable and do not allow you to go on the offensive? In all probability, on the contrary, it is to be supposed that he is pursuing you with detachments, or at most corps, much weaker than the army entrusted to you. It would seem that, profiting from these circumstances, you could, with advantage, attack an enemy who is weaker than you, and destroy him, or at least, by forcing him to retreat, keep in our hands the greater part of the provinces that now occupied by the enemy, and thus divert the danger from Tula and our other towns of the interior. It will remain your responsibility if the enemy is in a position to detach a considerable corps for Petersburg and threaten this capital, in which not many troops could remain. For with the army entrusted to you, acting resolutely and actively, you have all the means to prevent this new misfortune. Remember, you still owe the offended fatherland an answer for the loss of Moscow. You have the experience of my readiness to reward you. The readiness will not weaken in me, but I and Russia have the right to expect on your part all the zeal, firmness, and success which your intelligence, your military talents, and the courage of the troops under your leadership presage for us. But by the time this letter, which proved that the essential correlation of forces was already reflected in Petersburg, was on its way, Kutuzov could no longer keep the army he commanded from attacking, and battle had already been offered. On the 2nd of October, the Cossack Shapovalov, while on patrol, killed one hare with his musket and wounded another. Pursuing the wounded hare, Shapovalov wandered deep into the forest and ran into the left flank of Murat's army, which was camped there without any precautions. The Cossack, laughing, told his friends how he had almost been captured by the French. A cornet, hearing the story, told it to his commander. The Cossack was summoned, questioned. The Cossack commanders wanted to use the occasion to capture some horses, but one of their superiors, who had acquaintances among the upper ranks of the army, reported this fact to a staff general. Lately, the situation in the army staff had been strained to the utmost. Ermolov, a few days before, had come to Benigsen and begged him to use his influence with the commander-in-chief to make him go on the offensive. Excuse me. If I didn't know you, I'd think you didn't want what you're asking for. I need only advise something for his serenity to make sure to do the opposite, replied Benigsen. Sorry. If I didn't know you, I'd think you don't want what you're asking for. I need only advise something for his serenity to be sure to do the opposite, replied Benigsen. The news of the Cossacks, confirmed by patrols that were sent out, proved that the event had finally ripened. The taut string jumped, the clock hissed, and the bells chimed. Despite all his imaginary power, his intelligence and experience and knowledge of the people, Kutuzov, taking into consideration the note from Benigsen, who sent personal reports to the sovereign, the same wish expressed by all the generals, the supposed wish of the sovereign, and the information of the Cossacks, could no longer hold back the inevitable movement, and gave the order to do that which he considered useless and harmful. He blessed the accomplished fact. Section 4. The note submitted by Benigsen about the necessity to attack and the information of the Cossacks about the exposed left flank of the French were only the last signs of the necessity to order the attack, and the attack was fixed for the 5th of October. On the morning of the 4th of October, Kutuzov signed the disposition. Toll read it to Ermolov, suggesting that he should occupy himself with the further arrangements. Very well, I have no time now, said Ermolov, and he left the cottage. The disposition drawn up by Toll was very good. As in the Austerlitz disposition, it was written, though not in German. Die erste Kolonne marschet to such and such place, die zweite Kolonne marschet to such and such place, and so on. And on paper, all these columns arrived where they were supposed to be at the appointed time and destroyed the enemy. As in all dispositions, everything was beautifully thought out, and as with all dispositions, not a single column arrived where it was supposed to at the appointed time. When the disposition had been prepared in the proper number of copies, an officer was summoned and sent to Ermolov to hand him the papers for execution. The young officer of the Horse Guards, Kutuzov's orderly, pleased with the importance of the mission given to him, went to Ermolov's quarters. He left, said Ermolov's orderly. The officer of the Horse Guards went to a general whom Ermolov frequented. No, and the general's not here either. The officer of the Horse Guards mounted up and rode to yet another. No, he left. I hope I won't have to answer for the delay. How vexing, thought the officer. He rode around the whole camp. This one said that Ermolov had been seen riding somewhere with some of the generals. That one said he must have gone back home. The officer went without dinner and searched until 6 o'clock in the evening. Ermolov was nowhere to be found, and nobody knew where he was. The officer had a quick bite with a comrade and went back to Miloradovich in the vanguard. Miloradovich was also not at home, but here he was told that Miloradovich was at General Kikin's ball, and that Ermolov must be there too. And where is that? Over there in Yechkino, said the Cossack officer, pointing to a distant manor house. How can it be beyond the line? They sent 2 of our regiments to the line. There's such carousing going on there. Now it's awful. 2 bands, 3 choruses of singers. The officer rode beyond the line to Yechkino. From a distance, as he approached the house, he could already hear the merry, concerted sounds of a soldier's dancing song. In the meadows, he heard with whistling and tourbillon, occasionally overwhelmed by the shouting of voices. The officer felt cheered by these sounds, but at the same time afraid for being blamed for taking so long to convey the important order he had been entrusted with. It was already past 8 o'clock. He mounted and went up to the porch into the front of the front hall of a big, intact landowner's mansion that stood between the Russians and the French. In the pantry and the front hall, servants bustled about with wines and food. The singers stood by the windows. The officer was led through the doors, and he suddenly saw the most important generals of the army all together, along with them the large, conspicuous figure of Ermolov. The generals were all standing in a semicircle, their tunics unbuttoned, their faces red and animated, laughing loudly. In the middle of the room, a handsome, short, red-faced general was briskly and deftly dancing the trepak. Ha ha ha! Go on, Nikolai Ivanitch! Ha ha! The officer felt that, coming in just then with an important order, he was doubly to blame, and he wanted to wait. But one of the generals saw him, and learning why he had come, told Ermolov. Ermolov, with a frowning face, came over to the officer, and having heard him out, took the paper from him without saying anything. You think he left by chance, a comrade from the staff said that evening to the officer of the horse guard about Ermolov. It's a trick. It was all on purpose, to undercut Konovnitsyn. You'll see what a hash there'll be tomorrow. Hey, welcome. It's all good. All right, section 5. Early the next morning, the decrepit old Kutuzov got up, said his prayers, dressed, and with the unpleasant awareness that he had to lead a battle of which he did not approve, got into a calash and drove out of Letashevka, 3 miles behind Turotino, to the place where the attacking columns were to assemble. Kutuzov rode along, falling asleep and waking up and trying to hear if there was gunfire to the right, if the action had begun. But everything was still quiet. A damp and overcast autumnal sky was beginning to dawn. Approaching Turotino, Kutuzov noticed some cavalrymen who were taking their horses to water across the road on which his calash was driving. Kutuzov looked at them closely, stopped the calash, and asked what regiment they were from. The cavalrymen were from a column that should have been waiting in ambush far ahead. An error, maybe, the old commander-in-chief thought. But having driven further, Kutuzov saw infantry regiments, their muskets stacked, the soldiers in their underdrawers eating kasha and toting firewood. An officer was sent for. The officer reported that there had been no order to advance. How's that? No, or... Kutuzov began, but fell silent at once and ordered the senior officer to be sent to him. Getting out of the calash, his head lowered and breathing hard, he paced up and down, silently waiting. When Eichin, the summoned officer of the general staff, appeared, Kutuzov turned purple, not because this officer was guilty of an error, but because he was a worthy object for the expression of anger, and shaking, choking, and getting into the state of fury in which he was capable of rolling on the ground from wrath, the old man fell on Eichin, making threatening gestures, shouting and swearing in foul language. Another man who happened to turn up, a Captain Brazin, suffered the same fate, though he was not guilty of anything. Who is this other swine? Shoot the scoundrels, he said hoarsely, waving his arms and reeling. He was suffering physically. He, the commander-in-chief, his serenity, who was assured by everyone that no one in Russia had ever had such power as he, had been put in a position, held up to mockery before the entire army. I bothered praying like that for the coming day. I spent a sleepless night thinking it all over. For nothing, he thought to himself. When I was a young brat of an officer, no one dared to laugh at me like this. But now, he was suffering physically, as if from a corporal punishment, and could not help expressing it with wrathful and painful cries. But his strength soon began to fail, and looking around, feeling that he had said a lot of bad things, he got into his calash and silently drove back again. The wrath he had poured out did not return, and Kutuzov, blinking weakly, heard out the justifications and words of defense. Ermolov himself did not come to him until the next day, and the insistences of Benigsin and Konovnitsyn and Toll that the same miscarried movement could be done the next day, and Kutuzov again had to agree. Section 6. The next day, the troops assembled in the appointed place in the evening and advanced during the night. It was an autumnal night with purplish black clouds, but without rain. The ground was damp, but there was no mud, and the troops walked noiselessly. Only occasionally the clank of artillery could be faintly heard. Loud talking, pipe smoking, and the striking of fire were forbidden. The horses were kept from neighing. The secrecy of the undertaking increased its attractiveness. The men marched cheerfully. Some columns halted, stacked their muskets, and lay down on the cold ground, assuming they had gotten where they were supposed to go. Some columns, the majority, marched all night and obviously did not get where they were supposed to go. Count Orlov Denisov, with his Cossacks, the most insignificant detachment of them all, was the only one who ended up in the right place and at the right time. This detachment halted at the edge of the forest, where a path led from the village of Stromilovo to Dimitrovsko. Before dawn, the dozing Count Orlov was awakened. A deserter from the French camp was brought to him. He was a Polish sergeant from Poniatowski's corps. The sergeant explained in Polish that he had deserted because he had been passed over in the service, and that he should have been a commissioned officer long ago, that he was braver than all of them, and therefore he had left them and wanted to punish them. He said that Murat was spending the night a mile away, and that if they gave him 100-man escort, he would take him alive. Count Orlov Denisov consulted with his comrades. The offer was too tempting to refuse. Everyone volunteered to go. Everyone advised making the attempt. After much arguing and considering, Major General Grekov, with 2 Cossack regiments, decided to go with the sergeant. But remember, said Count Orlov Denisov as he dismissed the sergeant, if you're lying, I'll have you hung like a dog, and if it's true, you'll get 100 gold pieces. Not replying to these words, the officer mounted his horse with a resolute air and rode off with the quickly prepared Grekov. They disappeared into the forest. Count Orlov, shivering from the cold of early dawn, excited by what he had undertaken on his own responsibility, having seen Grekov off, came out of the forest and began studying the enemy camp, which was now visible in the deceptive light of early morning and the dying campfires. Our columns were to appear to the right of Count Orlov Denisov on the open hillside. Count Orlov looked that way, but though these columns would have been visible from far off, they were nowhere in sight. It seemed to Count Orlov Denisov, and especially to his very keen-sighted adjutant, that the French camp was beginning to stir. "Ah, it's really is late," said Count Orlov, glancing at the camp. As often happens, once the person we have believed is no longer before our eyes, it suddenly became perfectly clear and obvious to him that this sergeant was a fraud, that he had lied to them, and would only spoil the whole business of the attack by the absence of those 2 regiments, which he would lead God knows where. How could anyone snatch a commander-in-chief out of such a mass of troops? "He really lied, the rogue," said the count. "They can be called back," said someone from his suite, who, like Count Orlov Denisov, felt mistrustful of the undertaking when he looked at the camp. "Ah, really? What do you think? Shall we leave it as is or not?" "Do you order them called back?" Call them back, Count Orlov suddenly said resolutely, looking at his watch. "It will be too late. It's quite light." And an adjutant galloped into the forest after Grekov. When Grekov came back, Count Orlov Denisov, upset by this cancelled attempt, and by the vain wait for the infantry columns, which were not yet in sight, and by the proximity of the enemy, all the men of his detachment experienced the same feeling, decided to attack. He whispered the command, "Mount." They formed up. They crossed themselves. "God be with you." "Hurrah!" rang out through the forest, and one by one, as if pouring from a sack, hundreds of Cossacks, their lances atilt, flew merrily across the brook towards the camp. One desperate, frightened cry of the first Frenchmen to see the Cossacks, and all who were in the camp, undressed, half awake, abandoned cannon, muskets, and horses, and ran off wherever they could. If the Cossacks had pursued the French, paying no attention to what was behind and around them, they would have taken both Murat and everything that was there. The officers wanted that, but once the Cossacks got hold of the booty and the prisoners, they would not budge. No one obeyed orders. 1,500 prisoners, 38 cannon, standards, and what was most important for the Cossacks, horses, saddles, blankets, and various objects, were taken on the spot. All that had to be managed, and the prisoners and cannon had to be taken in hand, and the booty divided, with shouting and even fighting among themselves. The Cossacks were taken up with all of that. The French, no longer pursued, gradually began to recover, formed units, and started shooting. Orlov Denisov waited for the rest of the units and did not advance further. Meanwhile, according to the disposition, der erste Kolonne marschet, and so on, the infantry of the belated columns, commanded by Bennigsen and directed by Toll, started out properly and, as always happens, got somewhere but not where they were supposed to go. As always happens, the men who had started out cheerfully began to halt. Displeasure was voiced. Confusion was sensed. They began moving back somewhere. Adjutants and generals galloped about, shouted, became angry, quarreled, and said they had come to the wrong place and were late, denounced somebody, and so on. Finally, they were all waving their hands and went on, only so as to get somewhere. We'll get somewhere, and indeed they did, but not in the right place, though some also got to the right place, but so late that they were of no use and only got themselves shot at. Toll, who was in this battle, played the role of Wehrother at Austerlitz, galloped assiduously from place to place, and everywhere found things the wrong way round. Thus he ran into Bogavut's corps in the forest when it was already quite light, and the corps was supposed to have long been with Orlov Denisov. Agitated, upset by the failure, and supposing that someone was to blame for it, Toll rode up to the commander of the corps and began to upbraid him sternly, saying he ought to be shot for it. Bagavut, an old, calm, seasoned general, also worn out by all those halts, confusions, contradictions, to everyone's surprise, completely contrary to his character, flew into a rage and said all sort of unpleasant things to Toll. I'm not going to take lessons from anybody, and I can die with my soldiers no worse than anybody else, he said, and marched on without a single division. Coming out into the field under the French fire, the agitated and brave Bagavut, without considering whether he is going into action now, and with only one division, was useful or useless, marched straight ahead and led his troops under fire. Danger, cannonballs, bullets were what he needed in his wrathful state. One of the first bullets killed him. The bullets that followed killed many of his soldiers, and for some reason his division went on standing uselessly under fire. Section 7. Meanwhile, another column was supposed to attack the French on the front, but Kutuzov was with that column. He knew very well that nothing but confusion would come of this battle begun against his will, and as far was in his power tried to hold back the troops. He did not move. Kutuzov rode along silently on his little gray horse, lazily responding to the suggestions to attack. You've got to attack on your tongue all the time, and don't you see that we can't perform complicated maneuvers? He said to Miloradovich, who was asking to advance. We were unable to take Murat alive this morning and get in place on time. Now there's nothing to do, he replied to another. When word came to Kutuzov that in the French rear, where according to a Cossack report there had previously been no one, there were now 2 battalions of Poles, he glanced sidelong at Ermolov behind him. He had not spoken to him since the previous day. Here they're asking to go on the offensive, suggest several plans, but we barely get down to business and nothing's ready. The alerted enemy takes his measures. Ermolov narrowed his eyes and smiled slightly, hearing these words. He understood that the storm was over for him and that Kutuzov would limit himself to this hint. He's having fun at my expense, Ermolov said softly, nudging Revsky, who was standing next to him with his knee. Soon after that, Ermolov stepped up to Kutuzov and reported respectfully, There's still time, Your Serenity. The enemy hasn't gone away yet, and if you order an offensive, otherwise the guards won't see any smoke. Kutuzov said nothing, but when it was reported to him that Murat's troops were retreating, he ordered an offensive, but at every 100 paces he halted for 3/4 of an hour. The whole battle consisted in what Orlov Denisov's Cossacks had done. The rest of the troops merely lost several hundred men for nothing. As a result of the battle, Kutuzov received a diamond decoration. Benigsin also got diamonds and 100,000 rubles. Others, according to their rank, also received many pleasant things. And after this battle, there were more new transfers in the staff. That's how it's always done with us, all the wrong way round, the Russian officers and generals said after the Battle of Torotinu, just as people speak now, letting it be felt that some fool somewhere does things that way, the wrong way round, and we would not do things that way. But people who talk like that either do not know what they were talking about or are deliberately deceiving themselves. No battle, Torotinu, Borodino, or Austerlitz, come off the way its organizers supposed. That is the essential condition. A countless number of free forces, for nowhere is a man more free than in a battle where it is a question of life and death, influence the direction of the battle, and the direction can never be known beforehand and never coincides with the direction of some one force. If many simultaneous and variously directed forces act upon some body, the direction of that body's movement cannot coincide with any one of those forces. There will always be the shortest median direction, which in mechanics is expressed by the diagonal of the parallelogram of forces. If in the descriptions of historians, French historians in particular, we find that their wars and battles were carried out according to a predetermined plan, the only conclusion we can draw from that is that these descriptions are not correct. The Battle of Torotino obviously did not achieve the purpose Toll had in mind of sending troops into action in good order according to the disposition, nor the one Ormala might have had of capturing Murat, nor the goal of the instantaneous extermination of an entire corps, which Bennigsen and other persons may have had, nor the goal of the officer who wanted to go into action and distinguish himself, nor of the Cossack who would have liked to get more booty than he did, and so on. But if the goal was that which actually took place, and that which was then the general wish of all Russian people, to drive the French out of Russia and exterminate their army, then it will be perfectly clear that the Battle of Torotino, precisely owing to its incoherences, was the very thing that was needed at that period of the campaign. It would be difficult and even impossible to think up any outcome of the battle more expedient than the one it had. With the least strain, with the greatest confusion, and with the most insignificant losses, the greatest results of the whole campaign were achieved. The transition was made from retreat to offense, the weakness of the French was exposed, and the push was given which Napoleon's army was only waiting for to begin its flight. Section 8. Napoleon enters Moscow after the brilliant victory de la Moscowa, and there can be no doubt of the victory since the battlefield remains with the French. The Russians retreat and surrender the capital. Moscow, filled with provisions, arms, ammunition, and incalculable riches, is in the hands of Napoleon. The Russian army, twice weaker than the French, does not make a single attempt to attack in the course of a month. Napoleon's position is most brilliant. To fall upon the remainder of the Russian army with double its forces and exterminate it, to negotiate an advantageous peace, or in the case of refusal, to make a threatening move on Petersburg, even to return to Smolensk or Vilno in case of failure, or to remain in Moscow, in other words, to hold on to the brilliant position the French army was in at that time, would seem to require no special genius. For that one needed to do the simplest and easiest thing, to keep the army from looting, to provide a supply of winter clothing of which there would be enough in Moscow for the whole army, and to organize the collection of provisions for the whole army, of which, on the evidence of French historians, there was enough in Moscow for more than 6 months. Napoleon, the genius of geniuses and having the power of control over the army, as historians affirm, did none of that. He not only did none of it, but on the contrary, he used his power in order to choose, out of all the paths of action presented to him, the one which was the most stupid and destructive. Of all that Napoleon might have done, to winter in Moscow, to go against Petersburg, to go against Nizhny Novgorod, to go back more to the north or to the south the way Kutuzov went later, whatever one thinks up, nothing stupider or more destructive than what Napoleon did, that is, to stay in Moscow until October, to allow his troops to loot the city, then, hesitating whether or not to leave a garrison, to quit Moscow, to approach Kutuzov without starting a battle, to turn to the right, reach Mali Yaroslavets, again without trying his chances of breaking through, to go not by the road Kutuzov had taken, but back to Mozhaisk, down the devastated Smolensk road. Nothing stupider than that, or more destructive for his troops, could possibly have been thought up, as the consequences showed. Let the most skillful of strategists, imagining that Napoleon's goal was to destroy his army, think up another series of actions which would, as unquestionably and as independently of anything the Russian troops might have undertaken, destroy the whole French army so completely as what Napoleon did. Napoleon the genius did that. But to say that Napoleon destroyed his army because he wanted to or because he was very stupid would be just as unfair as to say that Napoleon brought his army as far as Moscow because he wanted to and because he was very intelligent and a genius. In either case, his personal activity, having no more power than the personal activity of each soldier, merely coincided with the laws according to which the phenomenon occurred. Historians, quite falsely, only because what followed did not justify his actions, describe for us the weakening of Napoleon's powers in Moscow, just as earlier, and also later, in the year 13, he employed all his skill and power to do the best for himself and his army. Napoleon's activity during this time was no less astounding than in Italy, Egypt, in Austria, and in Prussia. We do not know for certain how great Napoleon's genius really was in Egypt, where 40 centuries looked down upon his greatness, because all his great deeds are ascribed for us only by the French. We cannot correctly judge his genius in Austria and Prussia, because information about his activity there must be drawn from the French and German sources, and the incomprehensible surrender into captivity of whole corps without battle and of fortresses without a siege was bound to incline the Germans towards recognizing his genius as the sole explanation of the war that was conducted in Germany. But we, thank God, have no reason to recognize his genius in order to cover up our shame. We paid for the right to look at the matter simply and directly, and we shall not give up that right. His activity in Moscow is as astonishing and marked by genius as everywhere else. Order after order and plan after plan proceeded from him from the time of his entry into Moscow until he leaves. The absence of the inhabitants and the deputation and burning of Moscow itself did not throw him off. He did not lose sight either of the welfare of his army, nor of the doings of the enemy, or of the welfare of the people of Russia, or the management of the affairs in Paris, or of diplomatic considerations to do with terms for the coming peace. Section 9. In military respects, Napoleon, as soon as he enters Moscow, gives General Sebastiani strict orders to keep track of the movements of the Russian army, sends corps to various roads, and orders Murat to find Kutuzov. Then he makes careful arrangements for fortifying the Kremlin. Then he draws up a brilliant plan for the future campaign over the whole map of Russia. In the diplomatic respect, Napoleon summons the robed and bedraggled Captain Yakovlev, who does not know how to get out of Moscow, lays out for him in detail his policy and his magnanimity, and, having written a letter to the Emperor Alexander in which he considers it his duty to inform his friend and brother that Rostopchin has arranged things badly in Moscow, he sends Yakovlev to Petersburg, having laid out his plans and magnanimity in the detail before Tolman. He sends this old man, too, to Petersburg for negotiations. In the legal respect, orders were given immediately after the fires to find the culprits and execute them. And the villain Rostopchin is punished by an order that his house be burned down. In the administrative respect, Moscow is granted a constitution, a city council is established, and the following is published. Inhabitants of Moscow, your misfortunes are cruel, but His Majesty the Emperor and King wishes to put an end to the course thereof. Fearful examples have taught you how he punishes disobedience and crime. Strict measures have been taken to put an end to disorder and restore general safety. A paternal administration chosen from among yourselves will constitute your municipality or city council. The latter will attend to you, to your needs, to your well-being. The members thereof will be distinguished by a red ribbon worn over the shoulders, and the mayor will have besides a white sash. But, excluding their time of duty, they will only wear a red ribbon around the left arm. The city police force has been established on its former basis, and through its activity already better order exists. The government has appointed 2 commissaries, generals, or police chiefs, and 20 commissaries or district officials placed in all districts of the city. You will recognize them by a white band worn around the left arm. Several churches of various confessions have been opened, and divine offices are celebrated in them without hindrance. Your fellow citizens daily return to their dwellings, and order have been given so that they may find in them the help and protection owed to misfortune. These are the means that the government has employed to restore order and ease your situation. But to achieve that, it is necessary that you join your efforts to it, that you forget, if possible, the misfortune you have suffered. Give yourselves to the hope of a less cruel fate. Be assured that an inevitable and shameful death awaits those who venture upon your persons or your remaining possessions. And finally, that you do not doubt that these latter will be safeguarded, for such is the will of the greatest and most just of monarchs. Soldiers and inhabitants of whatever nation you may be, restore public confidence, the source of the good fortune of the state. Live as brothers, render mutual aid and protection to one another. Unite to foil the intentions of the evil-minded. Obey the military and civil authorities, and your tears will soon cease to flow. In respect of the supplies for the army, Napoleon prescribed that to all his troops that they take turns around Moscow à la Mahad in order to stock up on provisions for themselves, so that in this way the army would be provided for in the future. In religious respects, Napoleon gave orders to ramener les popes, and resume church services. In respect, of trade and supplies for the army, the following was hung up everywhere. Proclamation. You, tranquil inhabitants of Moscow, artisans and working people whom misfortune has driven out of the city, and you, scattered tillers of the soil, whom a groundless fear still keeps in the fields, hear this! Stillness is returning to the capital, and order is being restored in it. Your compatriots are boldly leaving their refuges, seeing that they are respected. Every violence committed against them and their property is immediately punished. His Majesty the Emperor and King protects them and rewards none among you as his enemies, save those who disobey his orders. He wishes to put an end to your misfortune and return you to your homes and families. Correspond to his beneficent intentions and come to us without danger. Citizens, return with confidence to your dwellings. You will soon find ways to satisfy your needs. Craftsmen and labor-loving artisans, go back to your handiwork. Houses, shops, protective guards are waiting for you, and you will be duly paid for your work. And finally, you peasants, leave the forest where you have hidden yourselves from terror. Return without fear to your cottages, in precise assurance that you will find protection. Depots are being set up in the city where peasants can bring their surplus stock and plants of the earth. The government has taken the following measures to provide you with a free market. 1. As of today, peasants, tillers of the soil, and those living in the environs of Moscow can, without any danger, bring to the city their supplies, of whatever sort they may be, to the appointed depots, that is, to Mokhovaya Street and to Okhotny Row. 2. The said supplies will be purchased from them for the price agreed upon between the buyer and the seller, and if the seller does not obtain the fair price he demands, he is free to take them back to his village, and no one can prevent him by any means from doing so. 3. Every Sunday and Wednesday are appointed every week as major market days, for which reason a sufficient number of troops will be stationed on Tuesdays and Saturdays on all the main roads at such a distance from the city as will allow them to defend the supply trains. 4. Similar measures will be taken to prevent the hindering of those peasants with their carts and horses on their way back. Immediately, means will be employed for the restoration of normal trade. Inhabitants of the city and the villages, and you, workers and artisans of whatever nation you may be, you are called to fulfill the paternal intentions of His Majesty the Emperor and King and contribute with him to the general well-being. Lay your respect and trust at his feet and do not slow to unite with us. In respect of raising the spirits of the troops and the people, reviews were constantly held and rewards distributed. The emperor rode about the streets and comforted the inhabitants, and despite his concern with state affairs, he personally visited the theaters established by his order. In respects to philanthropy, the best virtue of monarchs, Napoleon also did all that depended on him. He ordered Maison de ma Mère written on almshouses, combining in this act a tender filial feeling with the grandeur of a sovereign's virtue. He visited the orphanage, and having allowed the orphans he had saved to kiss his helping hands, conversed graciously with Tutolmin. Then, according to Thiers' eloquent account, he ordered his troops to be paid in counterfeit Russian money he had made. Enhancing the use of these methods by an act worthy of himself and the French army, he had aid distributed to the victims of the fire. But food supplies, being too precious to be given to strangers who were, for the most part, enemies, Napoleon preferred to provide them with money, so that they could provide for themselves elsewhere, and he had paper rubles distributed to them. In respect of army discipline, orders were constantly issued about severe punishment for the non-fulfillment of duty and about putting an end to looting. Section 10. But, strangely enough, all these instructions, concerns, and plans were being by no means worse than others issued in similar cases, did not touch the essence of the matter, but like hands of a clock, with the mechanism removed, turned arbitrarily and aimlessly, without catching the gears. In the military respect, the brilliant plan of the campaign, of which Thiers said that his genius had never imagined anything more profound, more skillful, and more admirable, and concerning which Thiers, getting into polemics with Mr. Fane, proves that the drawing up of this brilliant plan should be dated not to the 4th but the 15th of of October, this plan never was and never could have been carried out because nothing in it was close to reality. The fortifying of the Kremlin, for which La Mosquée, as Napoleon called the Church of Basil the Blessed, was to be raised, proved totally useless. The mining of the Kremlin only went towards fulfilling the emperor's wish that, as he left Moscow, the Kremlin should be blown up. That is, the floor against which the little child hurt himself should be given a beating. The pursuit of the Russian army, which so preoccupied Napoleon, produced an unheard-of phenomenon. The French generals lost the 60,000-man Russian army, and, in Thiers' words, it was only owing to the skill and, it seems, genius of Marat that they managed to find it, like a pin, this 60,000-man Russian army. In the diplomatic respect, all Napoleon's arguments about his magnanimity and fairness, both before Tolman and before Yakovlev, who was completely concerned with acquiring an overcoat and a wagon, proved useless. Alexander did not receive these ambassadors or reply to their embassage. In the legal respect, after the execution of the supposed incendiaries, the other half of Moscow burned down. In the administrative respect, the establishment of the municipality did not put an end to the looting and proved useful only to certain persons who took part in it and who, under the pretext of maintaining order, were themselves looting Moscow or saving their own property from being looted. In the religious respect, the matter that had been settled so easily in Egypt by the means of a visit to a mosque here yielded no results. 2 or 3 priests found in Moscow tried to carry out Napoleon's will, but one of them was slapped in the face by a French officer during a service, and of another, a French officer reported the following. The priest I had discovered and invited to begin saying Mass again cleaned and locked the church. That night people came again to break down the doors, smash the padlocks, tear up the books, and commit other disorders. In respect of trade, the proclamation to the labor-loving artisans and all the peasants received no response. There were no labor-loving artisans, and the peasants caught the commissaries, who ventured too far afield with this proclamation, and killed them. In respect of the entertainment of the people and the army with theaters, the business failed in exactly the same way. The theaters set up in the Kremlin and in Pozniakov's house closed at once because the actresses and actors were robbed. Even philanthropy did not yield the desired result. Counterfeit and non-counterfeit banknotes filled Moscow and had no value. For the French, who were collecting booty, there was need only for gold. Not only did the counterfeit notes that Napoleon so graciously distributed have no value, but silver was exchanged at below value for gold. But the most striking manifestation of the ineffectiveness of orders from above at this time came from Napoleon's attempt to put an end to looting and restore discipline. Here is what the army officers reported. Looting in the city continues despite instructions to put an end to it. Order has not yet been restored, and there is not a single merchant who carries on trade in a legal way. Only the sutlers allow themselves to sell, and stolen goods at that. Part of my district continues to be prey to the looting soldiers from the Third Corps, who, not content with resting from the wretches hiding in basements the little they have left, even have the ferocity to wound them with the jabs of their sabers, of which I have seen several examples. Nothing new, except that the soldiers allow themselves to steal and loot. 9th of October. The robbery and looting go on. There is a gang of thieves in our district that would need strong guards to arrest. 11th of October. The emperor is extremely displeased that, despite strict orders to put an end to looting, all we see is detachments of marauding guards coming back to the Kremlin. Disorder and looting were renewed worse than ever among the old guard last night, and today. The emperor regrets to see that the picked soldiers appointed to protect his person, and supposed to give an example of subordination, push their disobedience to such a degree that they break into cellars and storerooms reserved for the army. Others have lowered themselves so far as to disobey sentries and guard officers, abusing and beating them. The Grand Marshal of the palace complains loudly, wrote the governor, that despite repeated prohibitions, the soldiers continue to satisfy their needs in all the courtyards and even right under the emperor's windows. This army, like a herd let loose, trampling underfoot the fodder that might save it from starvation, was falling apart and perishing with every extra day it spent in Moscow. Yet it did not budge. It began to flee only when it was suddenly seized by panic fear caused by the interception of its supply trains on the Smolensk road and by the Battle of Turretino. This same news of the Battle of Turretino, which Napoleon received unexpectedly during a review, aroused in him a desire to punish the Russians, as Thiers says, and he gave orders for departure, which was what the whole army was demanding. Fleeing from Moscow, the men of this army took along everything they had looted. Napoleon also carted his own personal trésor with him. Seeing the baggage train that encumbered the army, Napoleon was horrified, as Thiers said. But for all his experience of war, he did not order the burning of all superfluous wagons, as he had done with the wagons of a certain marshal when approaching Moscow, but looked at the calèches and carriages in which the soldiers were riding and said that it was very good that the vehicles would be used for provisions, the sick and the wounded. The plight of the whole army was like the plight of a wounded animal that feels itself perishing and does not know what it is doing. To study the skillful maneuvers and aims of Napoleon and his army from the moment of his entry into Moscow until the destruction of that army is the same as studying the meaning of the dying leaps and convulsions of a mortally wounded animal. Very often a wounded animal, hearing a rustle, rushes towards the hunter's shot, runs forward, then back, and hastens to its own end. That was what Napoleon was doing under the pressure of his whole army. The rustle of the Battle of Turretino frightened the beast, and it rushed ahead towards the shot, ran as far as the hunter, turned back, then ahead, then back again, and finally, like a beast, ran back over its old familiar tracks, that is, over the most disadvantageous and dangerous path for it. Napoleon, whom we imagine as guarding this whole movement, as a savage imagines that the figure carved on the prow of a ship is the force that guides it, Napoleon, during all this time of his activity, was like a child who, holding the straps tied inside a carriage, fancies that he is driving it. And there we have it. That is the end of section 10. We will stop there today. And that will... Oh, that's right. It's Friday, so I guess I won't see you again until Monday. Thank you guys for sticking around. That was quite... Again, this is one of those philosophical sections of Tolstoy when he really waxes on about his thoughts on historians and the nature of things and the nature of how battles and how the course of history is forged. But still very interesting. And so now we have that one battle. And I kind of love the General Kutuzov, but also I'm like, at the same time, he could probably be a little bit more useful. Even if he doesn't think the battle's going to be successful, he's like, okay, let's stop for 45 minutes. Okay, let's go. Let's stop for 45 minutes. But I love how that, like, people are just... the one general who's, like, supposed to be getting orders is like, I'm just going to go to a ball and avoid getting my orders. They're all so... But they all, like, manage to somehow get, like, diamond recognition for it. It's kind of crazy. And yeah. Oh, yeah, the spoils of war. Yeah, no worries for being late. Yeah, the spoils of war. I mean, hey, that's kind of what ends up spoiling it for Napoleon. Like you said, that, like, the longer they stayed, the looting and the disorder just, increased, and that's what kind of ended up really destroying their advantage, or what could have been their advantage. So, yeah. So thank you guys for tuning in. It was a little long today, but like I said, we're going to stop now. And let me know a couple things. Hopefully you guys have a good weekend. Let me know how you think if the sound quality was any better or different. Like I said, I'm going to be testing a couple of different microphones over the next few days. Like the next week. I have one today, and so we'll play with the placement and but just hopefully we can get a little better sound quality here for the end of the book. And also, because it's the end of the book, maybe you might want to start thinking about if there is another classic piece of literature that you would want to read. Read aloud with me. So there's always that. You can always drop that or anything else in the comments. And I hope you guys are having a great day. Yeah. Military strategy. I love Tolstoy's view on military strategies in this. I think it's really interesting. He's like, you can have one, but then once you get into a battle, it doesn't really matter. And not that I've ever been in a battle, but I believe there's probably some truth, especially for that time period when it's not like there was really coordinated. It's not like you could like radio someone and be like, hey, you need to be here. They're just like, okay, we kind of got to get there. They don't have GPS, and we're just going to track through the woods in the middle of the night and hope we kind of get there by dawn. Much less tinny today. Oh, cool. Great. Yeah, I can't wait to review what the sound quality is. Like I said, I have a couple more mics coming, so we're going to do some tests. And yeah, start thinking about what else you'd like to read. But that's all for today. Stay positive out there, peeps, and have a great day and a great weekend. Thanks. Bye.